Is there anyone who doesn't mind answering a few questions? Someone who's not shy. Thank you. What's your role and where are you from? You don't want to, okay. Yeah, where are you from? What's your role? And okay. Yeah. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is the practical application of AI. So Watson's the most deployed AI platform capability in the world across countries and cultures. And we have learned a lot. There's been success, there's been failure. And more than anything about the technology, the process, the governance, how it's done, and how we align around the client's business need, how we push back and say no, because a project might be Byzantine, it might be a beautiful vision, but not a practical first step or a practicable first step. What is feasible and what are the metrics of feasibility is the short way of saying everything I just said. I founded the Watson Legal Strategy Consulting practice. I'm a former practicing lawyer and invented several Watson-based and analytics-based IBM solutions, one called Outside Counsel Insights for reducing outside counsel spend. Having been a lawyer in financial services, it was really nice to go to an insurance company and stick one to the old lawyers because we were able to reduce this insurance company's outside counsel spend by $392 million, or 33%. And that's not bragging. The reason that's important is because it's actually a pretty typical ratio of the uplift. This is even in line with what McKinsey has recently said, between a 30 and 120% uplift of AI versus traditional analytics when it comes to the results that are produced. In that case, we were dealing with an electronic billing platform that the client already had that didn't account for the fact that lawyers can describe billable events in narrative, unstructured text in as many different ways as there are lawyers. It looked at keywords, and it produced their legacy tool a 4% reduction in outside counsel spend, and then didn't really hold flat. We got to 33% by understanding the ontology of the different, or the ontologies of the different legal domains we were dealing with, the unique linguistic nuances of practice area A versus practice area B, and that is going to be a theme in our conversation. Hopefully it will be a conversation. So how do you make it work, in other words? So about 80% of large enterprises have now invested in artificial intelligence, whether with IBM or with another vendor. Not surprisingly, healthcare, life sciences, telco, and financial services topping it off. Things like anti-money laundering, things like claims fraud, things like outside counsel spend reduction. But more than anything else, things, use cases, that account for the fact that people have, no matter what the industry now, consumer-grade expectations of anytime, anywhere, my way. You know, it doesn't matter if you're a digital nomad or a digital immigrant or a digital native. The fact is that every time you interact with your cell phone, every time you interact with social media, the perception of convenience is reinforced. And that perception gives you, no matter your role, again, no matter your industry, as an end user of anything, even manual non-digital services, an expectation of personalized service that is impossible to scale without the aid of technology. So that's the world that we live in now, one where technologies for the better part of the past 20 years, like cellular, digital, in general, but I'll just, cellular, internet, IoT recently, blockchain, analytics, AI, all of these have changed our perceptions and expectations. And while many of us are deeply aware of the technical implications, what about the business implications? What about the implications for the end user? And it's not as expensive as it ever was in the past. The barriers are low to go start up a startup, to go to Sand Hill Road and get some capital. Not that it's that easy, but it's not as hard as it ever was. So how are businesses competing? They're competing on, after conducting a global survey of 36,000 C-suite executives, they are buying AI, and this is true in higher education as well, to get closer to the client satisfaction and retention. That's why they're doing it. 70% of all software projects fail that are external end user facing due to lack of alignment and lack of understanding of the end user's experience. All that design thinking stuff makes a great deal of sense because it's know-me technology and know-me processes that people want. And they have every right to want them. $2.9 trillion by 2021. That's how much we anticipate AI augmentation will generate in net new revenue. And 6.2 billion hours of worker productivity will be augmented. That's just what's augmented. That's not what people will be able to do with AI that we're not already doing, that we can't augment, like scaling the ability to read 28 million medical journal articles, understand what the doctors mean by what they say in the context of their practice, and put forth new insights that didn't exist before. In fact, it makes sense to start with a story, really, before we get into it, that highlights where we were 5 years ago so that I can paint a picture of where we are now. Baylor University College of Medicine engaged us 5 years ago to help them study a protein called p53, which inhibits tumor growth in cancer patients. And they wanted to see if they could accelerate the process of discovering ancillary proteins. So they found p53 20 years ago, and over the next 19 years, at a rate of about 1 protein per year, they found 19 more that acted as a switch to essentially turn p53 on or off in various different ways. They wanted to accelerate that process. 1 a year wasn't quite good enough, so they came to us and they posed a challenge. They said, we will be happy to give you our business and a reference if you can help us do this. But while we will tell you everything we know about p53, we won't tell you which 19 additional proteins we discovered. We won't give you any of the medical research post the discovery of p53. However, we will give you 28 million medical journal articles, the New England Journal of Medicine and so forth, pure narrative, unstructured text. I'm feeling blue because it's raining cats and dogs, but what do I mean by that if I'm an oncologist or a nephrologist or, well, in this case, it was oncology. 28 million of them and 3 oncologists who could help train it to understand the ontology of oncology. And we turned it on after training it for a little while, about 1.5 years. Now the process would take perhaps 2 months, depending on the complexity of the underlying language domain. And it didn't take 20 years or 19 years or 10 years or a year. It took a couple weeks to find those same 19 proteins. Plus, we found 7 additional proteins, so almost 50% as many, that the human doctors had no idea existed. So a lot of times, when I talk about AI and when people talk to me about AI, it's often in the context of augmenting things people already do. But I think it was Noah Yuval Harari who wrote *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*. If you read those books, they're great philosophy books on futurism, kind of a Ray Kurzweil sort of a figure. You don't build a submarine that swims like a fish. You don't build an airplane that flies like a bird. What can you do that's not already being done? And that was 5 years ago. So what are we doing now? Well, interestingly, there's a plethora of point solutions out there. Venture-backed point solutions that are non-interoperable, created by some fantastic companies, but those companies are economically motivated to get purchased. And, what cloud is it going to be in? How do I explain AI? If I'm a driverless car company, who am I going to put on the stand when the car hits 4 people rather than 7 people? And that was reasonable versus what a human being would have done. How do you prove that if you don't understand the black box source code? I don't know. Well, we have an answer to that too. We really will talk about these things. The last best experience that you had anywhere is now the minimum expectation for success, for what you expect everywhere. Insight-driven, customized experiences. And the cute phrases here aren't really what's important. What's important is that where big companies had an advantage over small companies for a long, long time, now it's fast companies that have an advantage over slow companies. These are just examples, but one of the things that these companies have in common is that their advantage didn't come from the technology at all. It was an enabler of their existing strategy. AI, properly framed, is a tactic for executing upon an existing business strategy, as opposed to, I want to do something with AI, something talismanic, something optical. As opposed to that, what can I do with it that makes sense from my business perspective and my workflow perspective? And when I talk about customization with AI, I really mean it. So there are 60 plus different technologies that make Watson Watson. It's a composable platform, 60 plus APIs that can be configured in various ways. Some of those configurations have graduated into solutions that are highly configurable with models that can be trained on your data, not crowdsourced, anonymized, generic insights, but insights about you or your students or your business or your agency or your department, insights that you can act upon rather than one-size-fits-all analytic insights, which analytics is incredibly valuable, and I'm differentiating AI from analytics. It's obviously a type of analytics. What I'm really doing is differentiating deterministic from probabilistic insight engines, really, when I say analytics versus AI being probabilistic. The ability to notice patterns and trends in industries and across industries and say, here's a framework. Now, let's adapt it to you. Let's adapt it to your workflow. Rather than I arrogantly think I know what you want, I'm going to plop down a product and you'll either have a need for it or not. This newer approach allows me to be more relevant to you. It also allows you to be more profitable and to take more cost out because something is, on the one hand, customizable. So yes, services are necessary. A lot of venture-backed startups can't afford services delivery arms. They can't scale with services delivery arms. And yet, if I don't understand your business case, your business need, my AI isn't really AI, I would argue. It's one size fits all masquerading as AI. So what is it? I will not define artificial intelligence because it doesn't have a definition. It's a term of art. What we can say is that it's a science that encompasses predictive, prescriptive, deep learning, machine learning, neural nets, all nested together. It's a science that describes the various technologies that will change over time that help facilitate a computer-driven understanding or augmentation of tasks that human beings use to conduct. And the more interesting question, really, other than what is it, because that's like counting angels on the head of a pin, is what is it for? What is the business purpose of artificial intelligence? Simply, it helps human beings make better decisions. And it does that by augmenting not human intelligence, not by replicating human intelligence. That's impossible. It might always be impossible. Doom and gloom Terminator scenarios are really juicy and fun, but we don't even understand how human consciousness works, let alone how to replicate it, and how to replicate an embodied mind in a machine. But there's a critical component of intelligence, which is prediction. And that's what AI augments, the ability to predict. And I don't mean just forecasting future events. I mean the ability to fill in also gaps where information is missing. The ability to predict not just what will happen, but what goes here. And the reason that's so important, the reason that's so game-changing versus traditional analytics is because human beings are god-awful at predicting things. We're just the worst. Lawyers fail to predict accurate case outcomes 40% of the time, 40. Doctors misdiagnose fatal illness in the US 20% of the time, a number that hasn't changed since the 1930s. So when we're dealing with synthesis of lots of data, when we're dealing with professionals who are brilliant but also come with egos, when we're dealing with these things, and when we're dealing with all we've ever known since the dawn of civilization, which is siloed expertise, you have the carpenter, you have the priest, you have the farmer, you have the king. Well, still to this day in healthcare, you have all these specialists who see you as a collection of piece parts rather than a constituency representing a whole person. So AI can solve problems like that, context, holism, by helping us make better predictions. And in case you think I'm going into the weeds there, hopefully I'm not, what are we using to make these predictions? What's fueling these better predictions? It's unstructured data primarily, a term we've all heard ad nauseum, but I'll go ahead and define it anyway for the purpose of today as really, yeah, audio and visual, but mostly narrative text. The words on a page in a novel, words on a page in a contract, voice audio to text, voice to speech to text, transcripts, journals, legal briefs, peer-reviewed publications or publications that should be. Things where what I say would have been impossible even 5 years ago for a traditional computer, a traditional machine to understand, because if I said, so I live between Chicago and DC, I saw the Grand Canyon flying to California, most machines would have no idea. They'd make nonsense out of it. Did you now see the Grand Canyon flying to California? Or it's feeling blue because it's raining cats and dogs. Things like that where context matters. And moreover, where there are multiple layers of context. My profession, my culture, my role within my profession, where I'm located geographically. Is English my second language or third language? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, where context is everything. And where tone and sentiment and so forth result in this brew, this stew of human beings being able to communicate the same concepts in thousands of different ways. So AI helps us make better decisions primarily by relying on unstructured data and structured, but primarily unstructured data in hyper-context to help us understand what we should do next, or to help us identify patterns and trends that are non-obvious. It's highly contextual, customized insights, personalized predictions, which, by the way, think about a rules-based world. I was having a conversation with I keep coming back to law because actually it touches everything, but language is such a big part of law, just as in medicine. And think about a contract. Is this a good deal? That's what I want to know. That's what I want to predict. Think about an insurance claim. Which claims are likely to become lawsuits? Because once they do, the cost to settle them is 5x. So not just replicating existing processes, but how far upstream of risk can I go? Think about reading admission essays. Think about augmenting staffing for dealing with summer melt when you don't have enough call center agents. Think about recruitment, financial aid, chatbots that go beyond just Q&A, but can have a dialogue, a conversation, can ask clarifying questions, and can even have a persona. One theory is that some jobs of the future, it's already happening, jobs of the future, by the way, are creating personas for chatbots. Like Geico, the Gecko, has a persona that should be representative of the Geico brand, et cetera, et cetera. So Watson, at least, has these 4 elements in common. Almost all Watson technologies, and by the way, this is just a non-exhaustive list of certain of the Watson technologies that we can combine together in some way, shape, or form around a business case. They all understand language, as we've been discussing. What do I mean by what I say? They can reason. They form hypotheses behind the scenes. They use 300 different ranking and scoring algorithms, and they put forth evidence-weighted recommendations for action, or service insights. They learn so that they become an organic extension of you, of your workflow, your business, taking things like seasonality into account for, I'm just going to make something up, supply chain use cases. And they interact with you as you are, as a human being, rather than something very complex that, it's very hard, by the way, to switch from a Mac to a PC, even up here. It made me think, why doesn't this just intuitively understand me and the user interface that I'm used to dealing with? That's the future. Little things like that hung us up for a long, long time won't anymore. So they understand, they interact with us. Here we are. I'll tell you what, in conducting over 140 plus design thinking workshops in Europe, North America, and Asia, speaking with the heads of state, speaking with CEOs, speaking with workers in call centers, speaking with data scientists, all sorts of different people who are involved in an AI project or who want there to be an AI project. change management is really everything. And it sounds obvious to say that, but it's not obvious. A lot of times, a client will say, we want to do something with AI. You have to go and tell them, can't really do that, or it's political, especially within a university, where one department really, really wants to do something, although it might not be objectively the best starting place for the university, and yet they also want to scale. What are these starting places? What makes sense? How do you have that conversation? How do you help people understand that they can't purchase AI like a plug-and-play point solution? They just can't. They will fail. And the vendors who sell that to them will help them fail. A conversation about this needs to take place within organizations, and thank goodness is beginning to take place within organizations. But I can tell you the challenges that we face. So those 36,000 C-suite executives that I mentioned earlier, when we interviewed them, these are the challenges that they highlighted as being the most significant when it comes to implementing AI. Trust. Who trained my model? Who trained my model? Was it a random subject matter expert? I have no idea who trained my machine learning model. Yet, if I'm an insurance company or a bank, I'm exposing it to my business processes. Does it reason like a subject matter expert? Or who knows? Is it auditable forensically? Well, no, not if it's a black box. We've never been able to rip open the black box of AI. Insufficiency of employee skills, that's changing. Poor or inadequate data, got to have a data strategy. And no matter how good the technology is, the insights that fuel the technology, it's data. And if that data is not identified, and if there's not a governance model in place to strategically identify data going forward into the future, you're going to pollute the insights that you receive. It's not actually that significant of a challenge from a manpower perspective. It's just a little bit different. Determining a starting place. I see that one personally, more than anything else. And corporate culture resistant to change for a lot of reasons. Many of which are completely valid. People are afraid of being replaced or having optics that suggest that they're replacing their workers, which is why we have different flavors of Watson. Some organizations, for example, want to augment customer-facing employees rather than employees themselves. So it turns out that 80% of all data is on the internet. So incumbents, existing businesses, not startups, actually have the most valuable data to fuel the insights that you would rely on AI to produce. So when I said not crowdsourced models, taken from public records data, for example, this is what I meant. That's going to get you part of the way. But if you're looking for a competitive advantage, it's only going to last until that becomes table stakes. The real thing is, what have you done before? How can you operationalize your best practices, your know-how, to get your internal end users up to speed faster, to serve your external end users in a more idiosyncratic way based upon your goals, your business, with your data, with what you've done before? It turns out that most knowledge workers, professors, lawyers, judges, engineers, most knowledge workers, they spend 30% of their time just looking for data that is there. It's extant. It exists. But they're starting from scratch. So we've done all this work. IBM, almost 400,000 people at IBM. And I'm still finding instances where, we think we're the first to do this, but someone in Switzerland has done it before in a research lab or something like that. So being able to operationalize your best practices, and we hear digital transformation. What I think digital transformation really means, rather than just a nice thing to say, is embedding digital in your culture and exposing the DNA of your business function and operationalizing it going forward. And so that's not happening. It hasn't been happening, that is, until recently. It's beginning to happen. Another thing that's beginning to happen is IBM was the first to release a commercially available tool called AI OpenScale. It can integrate with Watson, and it can integrate with almost any third-party tool. So not just IBM stuff when it comes to AI, to explain AI. to create a forensic audit trail of machine learning processes from a decision-making perspective. We're happy to share the math with you. That's open. The same technology also indicates the existence of bias in data. Another big problem. I mean, imagine that you're working on a bail reform use case, right? Recidivism in this country. You want to make sure that everybody's equally represented by the data. Different ages, different races, different genders, different populations, different languages. How do you do that? If you use just mere statistical analytics, you don't know. And imagine what happens if someone peels that in the future and the state, for example, can't say how the automating judging decision made its recommendation. We want to avoid that. So trust in AI is essential. Trust in the data is essential. And we have AI OpenScale, which is the first method of getting there, both from a bias detection perspective and from a explainability perspective. The driverless car industry, mentioned before, of course, is very excited about this. So is government. And so are we, because one of the things we're proud of is not just the existence of the technology, but that it responds to what our clients have told us is important to them, which is this, yes, but also the ability to deploy this on the cloud of their choice, or in a Kubernetes plus Where environment, so that they can manage the infrastructure, and it's not calling out from an API perspective ever. So after 140 plus workshops, what did we learn in higher education? Well, I'm not going to go down the list and beat a. What we learned is that there's so much change taking place right now socially and in the job market that it's very, very difficult to put your finger in the moving river and say, this is what you should study right now. There's going to be a market for it. It's very, very difficult to predict that. I was having a conversation with a colleague last night about the importance of liberal arts coming back because, well, and some would say they've never gone away. I'd be one of them, but more importance paid to them. But education does not seem to be meeting the needs of students, industry, or society, according to our survey. At the same time, for consumers, meaning students, look at this. In 2002, this is how all consumers, I think students, again, communicated, right? So voice. Now look at voice. It's not that long. Though this is what they expect. They expect chatbots, and in fact, in our travels, these are the most frequent use cases we've seen and heard interest in from higher education institutions. And by the way, Watson's present in 324 academic institutions across 49 countries. So I'm sure everyone can read that just fine. I will read it to you. But so a virtual assistant for student acquisition, financial aid, in other words, for parents, but also a chatbot that can have a conversation, a chatbot, again, that will understand very complicated technical handoffs. Like, for example, if I ask, what is the distance between New York and Berlin? I get a response from a chatbot. Then ask, what about Paris? Traditional tools have no idea the relation back, that connection there. Or to ask me disambiguating questions. Or to change responses based upon not just the trained responses, the trained Q&A, but the patterns and trends that are identified that have to do with seasonality, as I mentioned before. The most deployed chatbot capability in the world, 24/7 personalized assistance to students moving through the enrollment and financial aid process. A tool that can follow the student through their academic career, so it can begin there, and often does, and then moves to helping incoming students once they matriculate. Housing questions, activity and association questions, really almost whatever you want. Aligned to workflows, not just getting a response, but getting a response with a map. Getting a response with, how do I reset my password? Here's the page where you go to do that, helping people self-serve. Personalized degree planning. What are the non-obvious factors that are at play with students who maybe they don't choose the right courses sometimes and they have to repeat, or they're having difficulty? What can we tell about the data? How can we micro-segment students so that we understand how people like that were helped in the past? and people like that. Each of these has a very long explanation associated with them, so at your convenience, if you'd like, we can talk about them. And then administrative planning for future course offerings. Based upon looking at a lot of different unstructured data. For example, looking at employment information, looking at patterns and trends in industries, even looking at mergers and acquisitions, looking at past students and where they went, and then looking at what competitive universities are offering, and then determining how many sections should be needed to meet student demand so that universities can budget according to, and be much more accurate in doing that and setting that budget according to course development, for course development and staffing. So less guesswork there. These are the most common patterns by far. Everything, so acquisition to what do we teach them? Not so much, this is interesting, it surprised us, not so much creating virtual teachers. Not so much any of that. There's a fear of that, and there's a disinclination to do it, and we respect it. But these more tactical use cases can take out a great deal of cost and enhance a university's brand as well. But when it comes to augmenting the teaching and so forth, a lot of universities, just most of them, aren't willing to go there quite yet. But it's probably inevitable at some point that there'll be some kind of augmentation of that, of course. All right, so I will finish by just summarizing this slide. So here are 4 things of what we see and what not to do. I need an app. I'd like to buy some AI. No, it's always going to fail, 100% of the time. Why? You can be interested in it. Let's have a conversation. But why? Why and where? Dancing with disruption. I'm going to create an innovation hub. Good, wonderful, brilliant. Hire a bunch of young kids, take grant money, just have them play around with stuff. Good. A lot of times students are doing the testing for vendors who are selling POCs and MVPs and so forth, but almost all the time, the problem with that is, and it works sometimes, but the problem with that is those students don't understand the business case. They're not the business end user. Also, back to who trained my model. Do you want a model that thinks like students? In some cases, yes, fine. In some cases, think about that. Efficiency only. Cost takeout's great, but what can we do over and above efficiency that might be more transformative? And again, not just to be transformative, but to help you execute upon an existing strategy. And innovation, where we really see this in higher education, and government as well, is siloed innovation, which is why Department A might be doing a great thing. A lot of that might be relevant to Department B. But obviously, siloed innovation. Governance is so important. Governance is so important. Having a plan in place, as I mentioned before, but really this is where the rubber hits the road with governance, having a plan in place to scale so that, there'll be turnover, people will come, people will go, but you have a plan for how to evaluate an AI-based use case no matter the vendor. What are the minimum criteria of success? What are the KPIs? How do you define a KPI for a different business function? Specifically, how do you rank what to do, in what order? From a minimum viable product all the way up to implementation and runtime. How? Having a model in place is one of the most significant factors for success across industries. Make your end user your North Star. So what's coming? I'll actually close with this. What's coming? We get to see a lot of very, very, very cool stuff at IBM. Probably the theme that runs through what's coming, all the different projects people are working on from an AI perspective, more than anything else, is holistic insights. So really goes back to what I've said before. I'll give you an example. So I'm standing in front of a bookshelf in a library. Each book was written by a different expert. And right now, If I'm an expert in one topic, one of those books represents, I can go and I can read that book, find it, and learn something and understand it. But suppose that I need to understand the whole topic, the whole category of data that shelf represents. Let's say it represents material science, and I need to create a new material, or I'd like to create a new material for an airplane bulkhead. Bear with me. Something super light. Well, imagine being able to ingest all that information, along with the ability to ingest the understanding of that information, not just the data, but the trained data, the scaled expertise of the human beings who wrote those books, and then asking an oracle, and then asking, Watson, what is the best material to use so that I can build this aircraft, so that it can take up vertically, so that it can go this fast in a headwind, and then it analyzes existing materials and papers on existing materials. It analyzes the skeletal structure of flying birds. It analyzes the information about aerodynamics as well as airplane blueprints. And it does more of that than we ever could. And it comes up with a more holistic response. And same thing, take that to healthcare. Take that to how should I spend the discretionary portion of the federal budget this year if I want to increase STEM jobs for young girls in the Deep South? What do I do? I can wing it, and I can have a heavily politically influenced process, but maybe there's evidence now. This is the future. It's the ability to scale insights, and because of that, I would respectfully suggest augment creativity. Because creativity often occurs when you take an expert or a series of them from one area and you thrust them into a new domain, and it's the way they think, not just their existing know-how, that really has value, like the NASA Tiger Team concept. Once you do that, you'll get new insights that can't be thought up on purpose. And that is 4 or 5 years away. I urge you to, at your own leisure and discretion, research Project Debater, which is an IBM project that is getting very close to everything I've just summarized here as a first step in that direction. Not an expert system, which AI is today, not an expert in a discrete area, but a polymath. Any questions? Debater. Any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
You mentioned briefly about the STEM club females in the South. Yesterday we had a very insightful keynote regarding just that very idea of more women in technology. How would that approach work with something like AI and Ross in particular? And how would you obtain that data from an unbiased source or sources? I'm curious
Yeah.
how that would happen.
The reason I brought up the discretionary portion of the federal budget is because it's about 30% of the budget every year. Some of that always goes to the military, but that also goes to higher education and other discretionary science, important things. And there's an office, a congressional office of experts it's nonpartisan, and their job is to research and then make a proposal on how to invest that money the following year. So you have experts, housing experts, military experts, poverty experts, economists, technologists. I think, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the office of, but people who are renowned experts, almost in a House of Lords kind of way, if you will, equivalent. And then they present their recommendation. And again, they're nonpartisan. They present their recommendation. The people that receive that recommendation are partisan. What if you could synthesize all that research? Because the housing expert's not talking to the Veterans Affairs expert. That's a starting place. You go to where the experts are. You try to find an analogous workflow where someone, however imperfectly, is already doing the thing that you're trying to augment, and see what kind of uplift you can get from there. If there's nothing in place, then you have to be that much more creative. But does that help? Does that help?
Yeah, I guess one of the things I'd like to know is how do you obtain that data from people
Yeah.
Watson, you can get some sort of predictive result as to why is this result not happening?
Yeah.
Why are we seeing this result happening? What's the
I love that question. The who trained my model question. Why should I trust it? Even if I can forensically audit it, so what? Who trained it? Whose know-how does it reflect? Maybe that's the most significant challenge in AI is if we're talking about scaling expertise, it's getting it out of the head of the right expert or experts and into the tool. Not just pushed down to interns, right? So you can imagine a scenario, whoever invents this is going to come up with the next big company, and they'll have machine learning models with that are trained and can be infused into almost any system, no matter the vendor. And it will be the models rather than the tech, probably, that will drive the revenue for these companies. But imagine a digital vault where the company, I want to create a solution that reasons about quantum physics. So I want certain kinds of physicists. I create a digital vault. I know the training data. Let's say I do. I know the training data. Put it in there. I lock it, and I lock it with blockchain. I lock it with smart contract protocols. And the expert presents his or her credentials. And if they pass that threshold, then the digital vault is unlocked. They get to train or participate in training that data. And they don't need to know how to code. They have Python, R, none of that. It looks like highlighting a page. They train it. You get enough of them to do it with the right credentials. And then you pay them a royalty, or you pay them on the front end. And that's probably the only way to incentivize true know-how infusion into AI. That's our 2 cents. Yes, sir.
I was just thinking about history and they have you got unstructured data that you're reading from text from way back to present, morals, ethics, and stuff.
Yeah.
You change over time, and from text and from reading, when they're applying certain things. How does the AI,
Yeah.
how do you?
Well, Google has that. You can see certain words and how they've changed over time. By looking back through non-copyrighted materials. AI will have a culture. It will reflect the culture of the country or countries, states that develop it. There's no way around that. And linguistically as well. Yeah. And that's a very dangerous thing. Maybe. Yes, sir.
You happen to know what the business strategy is of IBM buying the Weather Channel and using Watson for
Yeah.
prediction? I think that's really cool. And it's a great application.
So we bought the weather company, and David Kenny, who is the CEO of the weather company, he is now at Nielsen as of late last year, but he managed the Watson business, which is a 2,000-person startup, industry-specific startup within IBM, really, walled off from a lot of the traditional way of doing things, as an experiment that's been working. The weather company has IoT data that is incredibly valuable. And the next big thing, right, is everything reports out to the internet. And like pixels making up the image of a clear digital picture, the more pixels, the better the image. Some of that's unstructured data. A lot of that, too, is just, paying for your groceries without having to check out. You have a sensor. It's clothing that can detect the rain. It's fraud analytics that are able to tell your insurer whether you were in the zone of danger. Is that really hail damage? Or give you an incentive to get out of the zone of danger very, very quickly. And what do you do with all that data? How do you collect it? How do you validate it? How do you store it? I mean, the amount of data is just it's incredible. So almost every phone has a weather company created, at least the source code, patented once upon a time, geolocation capability, and that's why. Yeah.
Can I, sorry to interrupt, there's another come out here, but you can continue to ask questions maybe in the lobby, if you don't mind?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you.